The morning of December 7, 1941, changed the course of world history forever. The roar of aircraft engines could be heard over the serene waters of Pearl Harbor, and a few hours later the Pacific Fleet of the United States of America turned into burning wreckage. This attack was a triumph for Japanese naval aviation and at the same time a fatal mistake that dragged Japan into a war with an industrial giant. However, at that moment, few people could have guessed what would happen next. In the early months of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a ruthless military machine that swept away everything in its path. For 6 months in a row, Japanese sailors and pilots did not know defeats. Their aircraft carriers plied the expanses of the Pacific Ocean like marine predators, appearing where they were least expected, and disappearing before the enemy had time to organize a worthy rebuff. The British, the Dutch, the Americans, all the Allied forces suffered one humiliating defeat after another. Behind these victories was a brilliant strategist, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who literally rewrote the rules of naval warfare. Before him, the Japanese Navy adhered to the traditional doctrine inherited from the days of the Russian-Japanese War. Powerful battleships had to engage in a decisive battle with the enemy fleet somewhere near the Japanese coast. This strategy involved passively waiting for the enemy to attack and trying to defeat them in a single-pitched battle. Yamamoto understood that such an approach was doomed to failure in the war against the United States. America had enormous industrial potential and could produce ships faster than Japan could sink them. Time was working against the land of the rising sun. Therefore, the admiral developed a radically different concept. Instead of a defensive war of attrition, Japan was supposed to launch a series of lightning strikes, seize strategically important territories and create a powerful defensive perimeter that would be too expensive for the Americans to break through. At the center of this strategy were aircraft carriers, floating airfields capable of projecting military power over vast distances. Yamamoto was one of the few admirals in the world who truly understood the revolutionary potential of carrier-based aviation. While other navies of the world still believed in the superiority of battleships with the powerful guns, the Japanese admiral relied on airplanes. But Yamamoto's real innovation was not just relying on aircraft carriers, but the way they were used. Instead of dispersing aircraft carriers across the fleet, using them as auxiliary vessels to support battleships, the Japanese assembled several aircraft carriers into a single strike group, the Kido Butai, or Marine Division. It was a completely new tactical unit that had no analogues in the world. Imagine the power of such a combination. 3, 4, and sometimes 6 aircraft carriers acting in concert could take hundreds of planes into the air at the same time. Such an air armada could destroy any target in range, be it an enemy fleet, a military base, or a fortified island. The coordinated attack by waves of bombers and torpedo bombers, covered by fighters, proved almost insurmountable for the enemy. However, the organization of such operations required an exceptionally high level of training and technical equipment. Coordinating the actions of several aircraft carriers, each carrying dozens of aircraft, was a logistical nightmare. Radio communications in those years were far from perfect. Radio stations often failed at the most inopportune moment, which could lead to catastrophic consequences. The slightest communication failure meant that the attacking waves could arrive at the target uncoordinated, losing the advantage of numbers, or that the escort fighters could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Therefore, the Japanese paid great attention to the training of crews. Becoming a deck pilot in the Imperial Navy was incredibly difficult. Out of every 1,000 candidates, only 70 people passed the strictest exams. They were elite specialists who had trained for years in the most difficult conditions. They could land on the swinging deck of an aircraft carrier in any weather, deliver precise bombing strikes and conduct aerial combat with any enemy. By the beginning of the war, Japanese deck pilots had no equal in the world in terms of training. The technical characteristics of the Japanese aircraft carriers were also impressive. The ships of the Shikaku class, which included the aircraft carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku, were considered the best in their class worldwide at the time of their commissioning. These giants reached a length of 257 meters, had a width of 26 meters and a draft of almost 9 meters. Each could take on board up to 72 aircraft of various types, fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Unlike many early aircraft carriers, which were built by retrofitting other ships and therefore had many design flaws, Shikaku-class ships were designed as aircraft carriers from the very beginning. This allowed the Japanese engineers to create the optimal layout. The ships had a modern reservation system that protected vital compartments from bombs and torpedoes. Their machines developed high speed, which allowed aircraft carriers to quickly take advantage of advantageous positions for take-off and landing of aircraft, an important factor in carrier-based aviation, where a headwind is needed to safely lift heavily loaded vehicles. The aviation support systems on these ships were also thought out to the smallest detail. Spacious hangars made it possible to efficiently service aircraft, and powerful elevators quickly delivered aircraft to the flight deck. Everything was subordinated to one goal: to raise the maximum number of aircraft in the shortest possible time and deliver crushing blows to the enemy. Armed with these superb ships and piloted by elite pilots, the Japanese fleet descended on the Allies with the fury of a typhoon. The success of Pearl Harbor was followed by a series of lightning operations. Malaya fell in a matter of weeks. Singapore, which was considered impregnable, capitulated, unable to withstand the onslaught. The Philippines, despite the heroic resistance of the American and Filipino troops, was occupied. The Dutch East Indies, with its rich oil fields, came under the control of Japan. One by one, the Pacific Islands became part of the Japanese Empire. In April 1942, Japanese aircraft carriers made a daring raid into the Indian Ocean. The British Eastern Fleet, still thinking in terms of previous wars, tried to confront the Japanese in a traditional naval battle. The result was predictable. Japanese planes sank the aircraft carrier Hermes, the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, as well as many merchant ships. The British were forced to withdraw the remnants of the fleet to the shores of East Africa, effectively ceding control of the Eastern Indian Ocean to Japan. It seemed that nothing could stop the victorious march of the Imperial fleet. Japan controlled the territory stretching from the borders of India to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The defensive perimeter that Yamamoto dreamed of was practically created. However, it was at this moment, at the peak of success, that the slow decline of Japanese naval power began. Americans learned from their mistakes with amazing speed. Their industry, having recovered from the initial shock, began to turn on a war footing. More importantly, American admirals began to understand how to fight in the new era of carrier-based aviation. They studied Japanese tactics, developed countermeasures, and prepared their aircraft carrier formations. The first serious collision occurred in the Coral Sea in May of 1942. This battle was the first naval battle in history in which the opposing ships never saw each other. All strikes were carried out with the help of aviation. Although the Japanese won tactically by sinking the American aircraft carrier Lexington, they did not achieve the goal strategically. The landing at Port Moresby was disrupted, and the aircraft carrier Shikaku was seriously damaged. But the real disaster awaited the Japanese fleet in June of the same year at Midway Atoll. Yamamoto, in an effort to lure and destroy the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet, planned a complex operation with a diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands and a major attack on Midway. However, the Americans, who managed to crack the Japanese naval codes, knew about the enemy's plans. On the morning of the 4th of June, the Japanese aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Saru and Hiru were approaching Midway, ready to deliver a crushing blow. The decks were packed with planes preparing to take off. It was at this moment, when the Japanese ships were at their most vulnerable, with full fuel tanks, open ammunition, and planes on the decks, that American dive bombers descended on them. The result was terrifying. In a few minutes, 3 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Saru, turned into flaming torches. The 4th, the Hiru, lasted a little longer, even managed to strike back, damaging the American Yorktown, but by evening it was doomed. By the end of the day, the Imperial Navy had lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers, more than 3,000 of its most experienced sailors and pilots, as well as hundreds of aircraft. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan has lost more than just ships, it has lost the striking fist of its fleet. But even worse, the Japanese industry could not make up for these losses. Building an aircraft carrier required years and huge resources, which Japan did not have. The Americans produced dozens of Essex-class aircraft carriers. The loss of experienced pilots proved to be even more painful. The Japanese have not created an effective training system for new pilots. The few hundred elite pilots that the Navy went to war with were practically irreplaceable. When they died, they were replaced by much less experienced young men who had undergone accelerated training. The quality of Japanese carrier-based aviation was steadily declining, while the Americans were constantly improving the training system, passing thousands of new pilots through it. The following months brought only disappointment to Japan. The protracted campaign for Guadalcanal had depleted the Navy's resources. In the Battle of Santa Cruz, the Japanese achieved tactical success, but lost even more irreplaceable pilots. The aircraft carrier Shikaku was damaged again. The strategic initiative has finally passed to the Americans. In April 1943, the Japanese fleet suffered another irreparable loss. On the 18th, American intelligence intercepted a message about the route of Admiral Yamamoto's inspection trip. A group of Lightning fighter jets ambushed over the Bougainville jungle. The plane carrying the creator of Japanese aircraft carrier power was shot down. Yamamoto was killed instantly by a bullet that hit him in the face. With the death of the admiral, the era of the Imperial Navy's dominance in the Pacific Ocean ended. The new commanders had neither Yamamoto's genius nor the resources to continue the war on equal terms. American industrial power began to overwhelm Japan with sheer mass production. There were dozens of American ships for every Japanese ship. There are hundreds of American pilots for every Japanese pilot. The remaining aircraft carriers of the Imperial Navy continued to fight, but their role became less significant. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier-based aircraft were almost completely destroyed in a battle that American pilots dubbed the Great Mariana Turkey Hunt. By the fall of the same year, in Lake Gulf, the remaining aircraft carriers were already being used simply as bait, distracting the American fleet from the main forces, which now consisted mainly of battleships. This is how the history of Japanese aircraft carrier power ended, beginning with the triumph at Pearl Harbor and ending with a complete collapse off the coast of the Philippines. Only 3.5 years separated the moment of the greatest triumph from the final defeat. Japan created a revolutionary concept for the use of aircraft carriers, but could not withstand a war of attrition with an industrially more developed enemy. Friends, that's what the video turned out to be. Subscribe to the channel, write comments and put likes. See you soon.